In late September 1994, the peaceful town of Grantham in Lincolnshire, England, was shaken by a horrifying crime perpetrated by a disturbed individual known as the Overalls Man. Julie Pacey, a 38-year-old mother of two, was found slain in her own home on the afternoon of Monday, September 26, 1994. Her 14-year-old daughter, Helen, discovered Julie's lifeless body on the bathroom floor after returning home from school around 4:15 p.m. At first, the teenager thought her mother had simply collapsed, but paramedics soon noticed telltale marks on Julie's neck. The brutality of the crime, committed in broad daylight in a supposedly safe residential neighborhood, left the community in shock and desperate for answers. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Julie Pacey's death was ruled a slaying almost immediately. Investigators determined she had been strangled from behind with some kind of cord or wire, and that she was also subjected to SA by her attacker. Yet despite the violence of the act, there were virtually no signs of a struggle or forced entry in the house. Julie's fingernails were still neatly manicured and unbroken, and nothing in the bedroom or bathroom was disturbed. This suggested that the assailant may have surprised Julie so quickly that she had no chance to fight back. The only immediate clue that something was amiss in the otherwise tidy home was that one odd item appeared to be missing. Julie's distinctive Luc de Roche wristwatch, which she had recently purchased on a trip to France and always wore, was gone. Aside from that, Julie's purse, valuables, and other belongings were left untouched, indicating that robbery wasn't the primary motive. Investigators painstakingly reconstructed Julie's final day to understand how this heinous crime unfolded. Monday, September 26, 1994, had begun normally for the Pacey family. Julie lived with her husband of 18 years, Andrew, who worked as a plumber. They also had two children, Helen and Matthew. They lived in a comfortable home on Longcliffe Road in Grantham. That morning, Andrew left early for work on a job across town, and the children went off to school. Julie's routine on weekdays involved working a part-time shift at a local preschool and often caring for a neighbor's daughter after school. That was, except on Mondays, the only day when the neighbor's child would never come over. And keep this in mind, because it suggests that the sinister individual we are about to meet may have stalked his target for some time. Monday afternoons were one of the few times Julie would reliably be alone at home, a detail that in hindsight appeared significant. Julie left home around 10 a.m. to do her usual shift helping at the nursery. She finished work around 2 p.m. that day and made a brief impromptu visit to her parents, who lived only a couple of miles away. Not long after, by about 2:30 p.m., witnesses spotted Julie casually window shopping in Grantham's town center. This indicates she didn't stay long at her parents' house before heading into town. Within minutes, Julie was seen back in her car, a distinctive maroon Audi. Neighbors noticed her parking in her driveway around 2:45 p.m. What happened next in the short window before Julie's daughter found her is a crucial part of the timeline. Evidence inside the house showed that after getting home, Julie changed out of her work clothes and likely began a few ordinary day-to-day activities. She also had laid out some makeup items and nail polish remover on the bed, as if she was in the middle of touching up or removing her makeup. These little details suggest Julie felt comfortable and safe at home, unaware of any looming danger in those moments. Investigators believe Julie may have left the house one more time briefly that afternoon. One witness, a friend who knew her, was adamant they saw Julie driving away from the town center back toward home around 3 o'clock. It's possible Julie ran a quick errand or went on a short trip after 2:45 before finally returning for good. Adding to this, a neighbor saw her come back home and have a direct interaction with the key suspect in the case around 3:10. If all these accounts are true, That left a very narrow window for the perpetrator to strike. Sometime between roughly 3:15 p.m. and 4:15 p.m., Julie Pacey was attacked and slain in her house. By the time Helen came home from school at 4:15, the crime had already occurred, and the perp had departed from the scene. This implies the predator had at most an hour to enter the home and commit his heinous acts, all in daylight on a residential street. All in all, it was an incredibly risky and precisely timed attack, suggesting that this had been planned out well in advance. Almost immediately, detectives honed in on some strange occurrences reported in the neighborhood around the time of the attack. Several residents recalled seeing an unfamiliar middle-aged man in blue overalls lurking in the area before, during, and slightly after Julie's death. This individual, quickly nicknamed the Overalls Man by the police and press, would become the primary person of interest, though his identity remains unknown. One key sighting came from Julie's own household. On the Friday prior to the attack, September 23, 1994, Julie had been at home in the afternoon, expecting the neighbor's daughter, who she usually watched after school. Around 3:30, the doorbell rang while Julie was vacuuming upstairs. Assuming it was the young girl arriving, Julie shouted for her to come in. Instead, to her surprise, a scruffy man in blue overalls was standing in her hallway. The man claimed to be lost and asked for directions to a nearby street. Julie gave him directions and the man left, coincidentally passing right by the neighbor's daughter as she was just coming up to the house. The girl later helped police sketch an artist's impression of this stranger. She described him as about 35 years old, fairly chubby with a big red face, wearing blue overalls and brown work boots. Julie had also noticed his rough, calloused hands, and similarly thought he was around his late 30s. This encounter was odd at the time, but in hindsight extremely sinister. This mystery man had essentially talked his way into her home with an extremely flimsy excuse. The Overalls Man was spotted multiple times around the vicinity that week. Witnesses later reported seeing a similarly described ruddy-faced man in blue work overalls loitering around the neighborhood and even in Grantham town over several days. He had been approaching people to ask for various directions, often to places that were nowhere near each other. Notably, he never needed the directions repeated, as if the questions weren't his true motive. This pattern led police to suspect he was scoping out the area and perhaps probing for potential targets. On the morning after the slaying, an individual believed to be the same man was actually seen in the area again. Around 9 a.m. on September 27th, a witness saw the blue-overalled stranger walking nearby, appearing to search the grass, as if looking for something he might have dropped. That same day, a shopkeeper in town reported an odd customer wearing blue overalls who acted suspiciously and aggressive, standing too close and behaving strangely. All these sightings suggested that the Overalls Man stayed in Grantham through the crime, and perhaps even returned to the scene afterward. On the day of the attack itself, the Overalls Man's presence was also reported. In fact, a woman named Mar Thomas later told police she witnessed a near accident on Longcliff Road around 3:10 p.m. that day. Julie Pacey's car nearly hit a man in blue overalls who stepped into the street. Thomas saw Julie drive past and wave apologetically after braking to avoid him, then watched the man turn around and walk back in the direction of Julie's house. This happened just minutes before Julie likely arrived home for the final time. The implication is chilling. The Overalls Man may have deliberately caused a confrontation with Julie's car, perhaps to confirm she was the driver, or to prompt her reaction. Then he likely immediately followed her, perhaps confronting her over the event he may have orchestrated. If he indeed then entered her home moments later, everything unfolded quickly. By the time Julie's daughter came home about an hour later, The overalls man was gone without a trace. Over the course of the early investigation, the overalls man remained the chief suspect. In fact, no other meaningful suspects would ever emerge in this case, despite extensive police resources leaving no stone unturned. Police canvassed the area extensively, knocking on doors and interviewing construction crews, since there had been a lot of building work going on in the neighborhood at the time. The initial hope was that this mysterious figure was simply a tradesman working nearby. However, those leads went nowhere. No local workers matched his description. Investigators even considered that the blue overalls might have been a kind of disguise, clothing worn to blend in with real laborers so that neighbors wouldn't find his presence unusual. With their best lead frustratingly out of reach, detectives also pursued other angles. As in any case such as this, those closest to the victim were scrutinized. Julie Pacey's husband, Andrew, was questioned and quickly ruled out as a suspect. He had a rock-solid alibi, and by all accounts the couple's marriage was happy. Investigators found no evidence of any secret life, affair, or grudge in Julie's background that would point to an enemy or someone who wanted her harmed. Friends and family described Julie as a devoted mother and a popular, well-liked member of the community. It truly appeared that the perpetrator was likely a complete stranger. The utter lack of an obvious motive puzzled the police. This realization was unsettling. It meant the crime was one of pure violence and predation, not an act incidental to some other crime. The notion of a stranger randomly choosing a suburban house in daylight to commit such a crime was almost unheard of, suggesting an exceptionally brazen offender. In July 1994, a 21-year-old woman named Sharon Harper had been strangled in Grantham, her body found dumped at a construction site on the outskirts of town. The Harper slaying was also unsolved, and the coincidence of two strangulations of women in one town within a few months raised fears of a serial predator. The British media quickly jumped upon this idea and dubbed the potential perp the Grantham Strangler. While the authorities have investigated the possibility, the police publicly downplayed any connection between the two cases. By 1998, the authorities issued a statement that the two attacks were likely separate incidents, conducted by two different individuals. Notably, this was intended to calm fears about a serial predator in the area, though I have my doubts that people are more comforted by two perpetrators on the loose. But hey, maybe that's just me. In 2015, more than 20 years after the events that took Julie's life too soon, a significant development gave the investigation new life. Thanks to major advancements in forensic science, Lincolnshire police were able to retrieve a full DNA profile of the likely perp from samples preserved from the 1994 crime scene. Detectives had another powerful tool that wasn't available in the 90s, the National DNA Database. They ran the profile, hoping for a hit, an identification of someone who had their DNA on record. But no match was found. The DNA didn't correspond to any known offender in the database. Notably, it's unclear if forensic genetic genealogy has been applied to this case yet, and I strongly suspect that this cutting-edge science may lock up the overalls man once and for all. In July 2015, a curious incident occurred, perhaps showing that no good deed goes unpunished. In an unexpected twist, many viewers who saw an old BBC reenactment of the event mistakenly identified the actor who played Overalls Man as a suspect. Several callers phoned to let them know that they knew the guy, and that his name was Steve Watson. They noted that this man happened to match the description of the perp exactly, and even exhibited some similar mannerisms, and that he was basically exactly 20 years older. It turns out he was the extra who had volunteered to portray the perpetrator in the 90s, since he looked a lot like the sketch. Lincolnshire police ended up tracking him down later in 2015, questioned him, and took his DNA, and he was, of course, ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing. Over the years, several theories have emerged about who ended Julie Pacey and why. The most straightforward theory is that the culprit was indeed the mysterious overalls man, an unknown predator who targeted Julie for reasons only he knew. The crime's nature suggests a violent, essay-motivated perp. Nothing was stolen, and the attacker risked everything for the opportunity to assault and end the life of an innocent, unsuspecting mother of two. Some profilers have pointed out that attacking someone in their home in midday is an extremely high-risk crime, which indicates a level of confidence and perhaps premeditation. In Julie's case, the offender seemed to know that Monday afternoon she'd likely be alone. This has led to speculation that the overalls man stalked Julie and studied her routine beforehand. The sightings of him lurking around asking directions and roaming the area for days support the idea that he was conducting surveillance and planning the attack rather than acting on impulse. Why Julie was chosen is harder to answer. Some have suggested that perhaps the man had seen her around town and become fixated, then formulated his sick plan of action over time. Others have suggested that his initial entry into her house may have been a dry run for what he was planning on doing. Another theory considers that the perpetrator might have been someone who at least casually knew Julie or her family. The precision of choosing the 1-hour window when she was alone could imply inside knowledge of her schedule. However, the investigation found no evidence pointing to any acquaintance with a hidden grudge or obsession. All known friends, neighbors, and family were cleared or had alibis. Thus, if the overalls man knew her, it was likely only from afar. The fact that no one recognized the composite sketch or came forward to say, "That sounds like so-and-so," in a town the size of Grantham hints that the offender might have been an outsider. Notably, a lingering question is the significance of the missing watch. That unusual Luc de Roche watch, brought from France, was the only thing taken from the scene. One viewpoint is that the perp took it as a trophy, a memento of his crime to relive the experience, a behavior not uncommon in serial offenders. Another possibility is that he removed it simply because it might have been touched or stained during the struggle, and he wanted to eliminate evidence linking him to the scene. If it was a trophy, it could someday be a key piece of evidence if found in someone's possession. Finally, the theory of a serial offender cannot be completely dismissed. The close timing of the Sharon Harper and Julie Pacey slayings, both taking place in one town, is an eerie coincidence. Both women were strangled within 3 months of each other, and both cases remain unsolved. Also stay tuned because I'll be covering Sharon's case shortly in a future episode. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here. Just quickly reminding you to hit that like button and share this video with your friends and family. It was a still autumn evening in rural Oxfordshire on November 3rd, 1888. Farmers had settled their flocks for the night, penning the sheep safely behind fences as usual. The countryside was quiet and uneventful. But shortly after 8 o'clock, that peace was shattered in a night of sheep-induced terror, an event that later writers would dub the Great Sheep Panic of '88. Between 8 and 9 that night, an unprecedented panic swept through flocks across roughly 200 square miles of English countryside. Sheep that had been calm just minutes earlier suddenly bolted as if some invisible terror had descended upon them. They smashed through fences and hurtled over pens, entire herds galloping off in every direction across fields and through hedges. The hill country north of the River Thames was especially hard hit, with shepherds later recalling that all their flocks seemed to go wild simultaneously. Villagers called out to one another in the darkness, trying in vain to understand what was happening as the sounds of havoc carried through the night. People stood in their doorways listening to the bewildering din of bleating and trampling, unable to see anything in the black fields. By the time the chaos finally subsided, the orderly calm of rural life had been upended. When daylight broke on November 4th, the full scale of the event became clear. That night, the normally polite sheep had seen their behavior take what I can only dub a U-turn. I'll let that one sink in for a second. Where there should have been neat flocks grazing on dewy grass, farmers instead found empty pastures and broken hurdles. Eventually, the missing sheep were discovered, scattered far from home. Many animals were found huddled under hedges or pressed into corners of fields, panting with fear. It was as if a nightmare had swept over the countryside, leaving the flocks shaken and disoriented, but thankfully largely unharmed physically. As farmers compared notes that morning, it became clear that virtually every large flock in the district had been affected. From one end of Oxfordshire to the other, few if any farms escaped the panic. The idea that tens of thousands of sheep in dozens of villages could all be terror-stricken at the same moment defied belief, and even veteran shepherds couldn't explain it. In the immediate aftermath, people grasped for an explanation. The first suspects in any livestock stampede are typically predators or pranksters. Could a pack of dogs or wild foxes have roamed the countryside that night, harassing sheep from farm to farm? It seemed highly unlikely given the scale of the sheep panic. Further, there were no telltale injuries or bite marks on the sheep that might suggest predators either. Human mischief was also considered and quickly dismissed. It would have taken an army of troublemakers working in perfect unison to frighten and release so many animals at once, something clearly impossible. With wolves, vandals, and human mishaps ruled out, attention turned to natural phenomena. Some pointed out that the night had been unusually dark, with occasional flickers of distant lightning. There was no raging storm overhead, only a bit of lightning on the horizon, something sheep often experience without incident. An exotic electrical disturbance in the atmosphere, for instance ball lightning, was suggested, but there was no clear sign of anything so dramatic in the sky that night. Others wondered if a tremor in the earth might have been the culprit. Animals are known to panic before earthquakes, sensing vibrations that people miss. Perhaps a slight earthquake ripple passed under the fields, startling the sheep in a way that was somehow not felt by any other humans or animals. However, no one in the region felt any quake, and observatories recorded nothing unusual on that date, though these were rudimentary by our standards. Similarly, some proposed that a meteor might have exploded high above, producing a sonic boom or flash that frightened the animals. But once again, nothing extraordinary was seen or heard in the sky that evening. Lacking any obvious external trigger, some experts suggested the cause might lie in the sheep's own herd instincts. One frightened flock can set off dozens more. If even a couple of groups of sheep had entered panic mode for any reason, their frantic bleating and movement might have carried through the still night air and alarmed other flocks. The sheep could have essentially fallen like dominoes across the countryside. In the end, no definitive cause was ever confirmed for the Great Sheep Panic of 1888, and it remains perhaps the greatest sheep-related mystery of all time. That is, aside from the mystery of the sheep with a star-shaped birthmark. In the dense woods near the village of Mals in western Switzerland, local residents whispered for years about a mysterious figure they called Le Loyon, also known as the Ghost of Mals. Beginning in the late 1990s or early 2000s, people sporadically reported encounters with a strange, silent wanderer in the forest. This figure was always described the same way: tall and clad in an ominous outfit. He wears a camouflage military-style suit worn under a cloak, with an antique gas mask completely covering his face. Yet the very sight of this apparition was enough to strike fear into the hearts of locals and hikers, turning the once peaceful Malls forest into the setting of a living urban legend. One of the earliest documented encounters came from a local woman walking in the woods in the early 2000s. She spotted a tall figure standing in a clearing, calmly picking wildflowers. As soon as the stranger realized he'd been seen, he dropped the flowers and fled into the forest. This peculiar incident set the tone for many future sightings. Le Loyon never tried to approach or attack anyone, and in fact often disappeared into the woods if spotted. Despite this, locals became quite afraid of the figure, believing he may be up to no good. All that said, local authorities were in a bind. Since technically, this individual hadn't broken any laws, if this person actually existed at all. After all, walking in the woods in bizarre attire isn't a crime, and there had been no reports of attacks or property damage. For a long time, officials chose to do nothing and hoped the figure would eventually just go away. In September 2013, Le Loyon was finally captured on camera, providing the first solid visual evidence of this mysterious figure. An amateur photographer had ventured into the Malls forest, determined to document the elusive wanderer. According to his account, he encountered Le Loyon along a familiar forest path. Summoning his courage, the photographer cautiously approached to within roughly 50 feet. The witness managed to snap a photograph just as Le Loyon was walking away, capturing the cloaked man from behind. The photograph provided validation to those who had been ridiculed for speaking of a figure stalking the woods. Local police, who until then had treated Le Loyon as a low-priority oddity, felt compelled to act. As patrols and local hikers began actively searching the woods for Le Loyon, the media frenzy grew. The intense spotlight on the forest would soon prompt an unexpected and dramatic turn in the story. Just weeks after the photograph went public, Le Loyon seemingly vanished. No new sightings were reported in the forest after September 2013. Instead, what emerged was a haunting piece of evidence left behind on a lonely wooded trail. Le Loyon's costume, the camo cloak and the gas mask, was found abandoned on the forest floor, accompanied by a handwritten letter. The discovery was made sometime in the fall of 2013 and was soon reported to the local authorities. The letter was titled "The Death Certificate and Last Will and Testament of the Ghost of Malls." This document is believed to be a reference to the retirement of the character and the urban legend surrounding it, rather than something more sinister or unfortunate. In the letter, the author, presumably Le Loyon himself, expressed frustration and concern over the recent publicity. The letter blamed the press for creating a climate of fear and endangering him. Notably, he referred to the Le Loyon character as bringing happiness to him, suggesting this bizarre act of walking in the woods had been therapeutic for him. In any case, after 2013, Le Loyon was never seen again, and the ghost of Malls forest had disappeared, leaving behind only questions. From the beginning, speculation abounded regarding the individual's true identity and motives. Without ever having unmasked the person, residents and investigators could only theorize about who would undertake such a bizarre daily ritual. Over the years, several popular theories emerged based on the sightings and the scant evidence. Many locals believed that Le Loyon might have been someone suffering from mental health issues, perhaps a disturbed man who found solace in wandering the woods in disguise. The forest walks, in this interpretation, were a coping mechanism rather than an intentional act hoping to scare others. Proponents of this theory pointed to the letter, presumably from the individual, which supports the idea of some sort of therapeutic effect from the somewhat unusual ritual. They also note that despite locals being concerned about the character, Le Loyant was explicitly non-threatening, except perhaps in appearance. Others suggested that the individual might have had a severe skin condition or facial disfigurement that led them to cover up completely for fear of judgment. In this scenario, Le Loyant's costume wasn't about scaring people, and instead was more about conquering his own fears and getting out without judgment from others. Another prominent theory was that Le Loyant had deliberately chosen a hermit-like, off-the-grid lifestyle. Perhaps he was a survivalist, someone obsessed with living in the wild, preparing for societal collapse or an apocalypse. The military gear and gas mask would fit the image of a doomsday prepper testing his equipment, or simply an eccentric person who enjoyed solitude and wanted to be fully left alone. Of course, some people wondered if Le Loyant was in fact an elaborate hoax, prank, or even a form of performance art. Maybe it started as a local prankster's project, or an art student's deranged social experiment that simply carried on far longer than intended. Notably, the local authorities at one point released a statement indicating that they believed the entire thing was a prank being played on the local community. If it was performance art, it was a remarkably dedicated piece, a silent, walking installation that only a few ever witnessed over the course of just over a decade. There are also those who believe that Le Loyant was something more, perhaps someone slipping in and out of time, or some form of extraterrestrial. That said, no evidence exists to support this conclusion.